A live confession, a lingering glance, and a room suspended between sound and silence. When Jungkook speaks, Taehyung listens, and the world holds its breath. The sentence did not arrive gently. It fell into the studio like a dropped glass, clean, sharp, impossible to pretend it hadn't shattered something. "I chose someone to marry," Jungkook said into the microphone. His voice was calm, too calm, the kind of calm that doesn't ask for permission, only attention. The host froze for half a second, cue cards trembling slightly in her hands as the red recording light continued to hum above them. The audience reacted in fragments, soft gasps, nervous laughter, a ripple of disbelief moving through the rows like electricity searching for ground. And then, without explanation, without drama, without a single word added or taken back, Jungkook looked at Taehyung. Not quickly, not as a joke, not with the playful glance fans were used to. He looked at him, the way people look at doors they're about to open for the first time. The air changed, not louder, heavier. Taehyung felt it before he understood it. The shift in temperature, the way the studio lights suddenly felt warmer against his skin, the faint scent of citrus and fabric softener drifting from Jungkook's jacket, familiar in a way that had never been dangerous until now. He did not move. He did not smile. He simply stayed where he was, shoulders relaxed, hands resting loosely on his knees, while something inside his chest forgot how to behave normally. The audience stopped breathing, literally, 1,000 people holding the same inhale, as if sound itself might break whatever fragile thing had just appeared between them. Jungkook didn't speak again. He didn't clarify, he didn't laugh it off, he didn't perform. He just kept looking. And Taehyung realized, with a quiet and unwelcome clarity, that this wasn't a moment designed for cameras. It was a moment that had escaped them. The host cleared her throat, voice soft and professional, the way people speak when they know they are standing near something personal. "That's a big statement," she said carefully. "Do you want to elaborate?" Jungkook blinked once slowly, as if returning from somewhere else. "I think," he said, still calm, "that love isn't something you announce. It's something you choose, every day, in small ways, in ordinary ways." His words were gentle, almost safe. But his eyes were still on Taehyung. And that was the part that was. Taehyung felt the room watching him without looking directly. He could sense it in the way the silence pressed against his ears, in the way even the cameras seemed to hesitate, unsure where to land. He had spent years mastering expressions, smiling at the right moments, laughing when expected, staying just ambiguous enough to protect everything that mattered. But this wasn't something you could manage with instinct. This was something that asked to be acknowledged. He felt memories surface uninvited, late-night conversations that never quite ended, shared hotel rooms where the lights stayed off longer than necessary, the way Jungkook always stood just a little too close in quiet spaces, the way silence between them had never felt empty, only unfinished. Externally, the threat wasn't scandal. It was clarity. The kind that forces you to recognize something you've been carefully living around. Taehyung swallowed once, slow and controlled, the way he did before difficult lines in scripts. His heart was beating faster than the moment deserved, or maybe exactly as fast as it did. Jungkook finally looked forward again. The room exhaled. Applause arrived late, confused, polite. The host smiled, relieved to have something resembling normality back in her hands. "Thank you for your honesty," she said, gently redirecting the conversation. "That was beautiful." But Taehyung barely heard her. Because what remained wasn't the words. It was the look. The way Jungkook had offered something without asking if it could be received. The way the moment had settled between them, like a secret that refused to stay hidden. When the cameras shut off, the silence became louder than the applause ever was. The studio doors slid open with a soft mechanical sigh, and the cast began to move again. Assistants calling names, producers checking schedules, reality resuming as if nothing irreversible had just happened. Taehyung stood up slowly, body moving on instinct while his mind lagged behind. Jungkook walked beside him down the narrow hallway, their shoulders almost touching, the familiar scent of cables, coffee, and warm lighting wrapping around them like a memory they both recognized. Neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because whatever existed between them had suddenly become too real to rush. The hallway lights flickered slightly as they walked, footsteps echoing softly against the carpet, and Taehyung realized something that unsettled him more than the confession itself. The world hadn't changed, but the space between them had. And once that space shifts, it never goes back to exactly what it was. Not without someone choosing to lie. Not without someone choosing to stay silent. And neither of them had done either. They reached the end of the hallway where the noise of the studio faded into a quieter, more intimate hum. The kind of silence that didn't belong to cameras or schedules, but to people who had just crossed an invisible line and weren't sure which side they were standing on anymore. Taehyung stopped first. Not dramatically, not abruptly, just enough for Jungkook to notice and turn. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The fluorescent lights above them cast soft reflections on the polished floor, turning their shadows into blurred shapes that almost touched. "You knew what that would do," Taehyung said finally. His voice was low, controlled, but there was something unfamiliar underneath it. Not anger, not accusation, more like pressure, the kind that builds when someone has been holding something in for too long. Jungkook didn't look defensive. He looked tired in an honest way. "I knew what not saying it was already doing," he replied. The words didn't land loudly. They didn't need to. They settled between them with a quiet weight, heavy because they felt true. Taehyung folded his arms, not to close himself off, but to keep his posture steady. He had always been good at managing expressions, but this wasn't about expression. This was about something shifting under his feet. "You turned something private into something everyone will talk about," he said carefully. Jungkook nodded once, slow, accepting. "I turned something silent into something honest." That was the moment the tension changed shape. Not sharp, not explosive, just warm, emotional, the kind of heat that doesn't burn but refuses to disappear. Taehyung looked away for a second, eyes drifting toward the emergency exit sign glowing faintly at the end of the corridor. His reflection in the glass looked calmer than he felt. "My fear," he admitted, quieter now, "is that clarity costs us what ambiguity was protecting." Jungkook didn't interrupt. He had learned over years when Taehyung was speaking from habit and when he was speaking from somewhere deeper. "And my fear," Jungkook said softly, "is that waiting forever feels safer than choosing but leaves everything unfinished." A producer walked past them, offering a polite smile, unaware of the emotional standoff happening in the space of 2 meters. The world kept functioning, even when something personal was trying to redefine itself. They moved into the green room. A small table with teacups still steaming. A half-open window letting in city air that smelled faintly of rain and metal. The kind of space designed for decompression, but now holding too much unresolved energy to feel restful. Taehyung sat down first, fingers wrapped loosely around a paper cup, not drinking it. Jungkook remained standing for a second, then sat across from him, posture relaxed but eyes attentive. "Do you regret it?" Taehyung asked. The question sounded simple. It was. Jungkook took a breath, not rushing. "No," he said, "but I respect that it startled you." That honesty disarmed more than any apology could have. Taehyung let out a slow exhale, tension easing slightly from his shoulders. He hadn't realized how much he was bracing for defense until it didn't arrive. I just needed to know, he said, that you weren't choosing the story over the people. Jungkook smiled faintly, not proud, not triumphant. I chose the people, he replied, even if the story noticed. The line stayed with Taehyung longer than he expected. Outside the room, phones were already buzzing, messages piling up, fans dissecting every frame, every glance, every breath. The moment was turning into content at a speed neither of them could control. But inside the green room, the noise lost its authority. Taehyung leaned back slightly, studying Jungkook in a way he hadn't allowed himself to in a long time. Not as a teammate, not as a public figure, just as someone who had chosen to speak when silence felt easier. You scared me, he admitted quietly. Jungkook didn't laugh it off. Because I sounded certain, he asked. Taehyung nodded. Yes. Jungkook's expression softened. Certainty doesn't mean pressure, he said. It just means I know what I value. That distinction landed deeper than Taehyung expected. The tension didn't disappear, but it shifted, from confrontation to something more reflective, less about what had happened, more about what it revealed. Taehyung looked down at his cup, then back up. You always choose the hardest way to be honest. Jungkook smiled properly this time, a quiet laugh escaping him. And you always choose the safest way to care. They shared a look that felt older than the moment, a recognition of patterns they had never formally discussed, but always lived inside. The conversation slowed, not because there was nothing left to say, but because neither of them wanted to rush toward resolution. Some things needed space to exist without being defined immediately. Rain began tapping lightly against the window. Taehyung noticed it absently, then smiled at the timing. Funny, he said, the noise comes after the decision. Jungkook followed his gaze, nodding. Maybe that's how it's supposed to be. They sat there for a while longer, not filling the silence, just letting it breathe. The kind of quiet that feels earned rather than awkward. Whatever had started under the studio lights hadn't ended there. It had simply changed form. And neither of them could pretend anymore that it was something temporary, or harmless, or easy to ignore. Not after it had been seen. Morning arrived without ceremony. No dramatic sunlight, no symbolic soundtrack. Just a soft gray light filtering through the rehearsal studio windows, flattening the city into quiet shapes and making everything feel slightly unreal, as if the night before had been a story someone else told them. Taehyung sat at the long table with a paper cup warming his hands, scrolling through notifications he hadn't opened. His expression was calm, almost neutral, but there was a low, steady tension beneath it. Not anxiety, more like awareness. The kind that stays after something important happens and your body hasn't decided how to file it yet. Jungkook entered quietly, bag slung over his shoulder, eyes immediately finding Taehyung before anything else in the room. He didn't speak right away. He just stood there for a second, as if checking whether the space between them still existed. I didn't sleep much, Taehyung said first. Jungkook smiled faintly, me neither. Not because of regret. They both knew that. It was because everyone else had decided to finish the conversation for them. They always do, Jungkook said, pulling out a chair but not sitting yet. And they always miss the part that matters. Taehyung finally opened a few messages, read a line or two, then turned the phone face down on the table. Some people think it was a declaration, he said calmly. Others think it was strategy, and some think it was unfair to me. That last word stayed in the air longer than the rest. Unfair. Jungkook stepped closer, voice lowering instinctively. I never wanted you to carry anything alone, he said. If it felt like that, I need to hear it. Taehyung hesitated. His fingers tapped lightly against the cup twice, the way they always did when he was choosing his words carefully. It startled me, he said, not because of what you said, but because it forced me to feel everything at once. Pride, fear, affection, responsibility. Jungkook exhaled slowly. I can live with startling, he replied. I couldn't live with pretending. The honesty didn't feel dramatic. It felt surgical, precise in a way that removed excuses without raising its voice. A manager walked in briefly with a polite reminder about schedules, the world intruding with its usual indifference. When the door closed again, Taehyung laughed softly, the sound edged with irony. This is the part I worry about, he said, how real moments become footnotes in a timetable. Jungkook finally sat down, leaning forward. Then let's decide what the footnote actually says. Taehyung looked up, surprised. You mean together? Jungkook smiled. I always did. The simplicity of the sentence hit harder than anything else that morning. They talked longer than planned, not in speeches, but in admissions. Jungkook confessed his fear of being seen as impulsive when he was actually deliberate to a fault. Taehyung admitted his long-standing belief that love survived best when it stayed unnamed. Two philosophies brushing against each other, not clashing, just testing their edges. When you looked at me, Taehyung said quietly, it felt like the truth stepped into the light without asking if I was ready. Jungkook met his eyes. I looked because I trusted you to stand there with it. The surprise wasn't emotional collapse, it was emotional alignment. The realization that neither of them had been wrong, they had just been careful in different directions. The day moved on around them, calls answered, schedules adjusted, but the core of the moment stayed intact, untouched by logistics. By afternoon, they found themselves alone again in the rehearsal room. The floor still bore faint marks from years of practice, the air carrying the familiar smell of wood and effort. Taehyung stood near the mirror, watching their reflections overlap. Next time, he said with a small decisive nod. If there is a next time, we choose the timing together. Jungkook agreed instantly. The agreement felt more important than any headline. Later in the press room, the lights were brighter than necessary, flattening shadows and making every expression feel exposed. Microphones were adjusted, chairs scraped softly. This was where misunderstandings were born. Jungkook leaned closer and murmured, "We don't have to answer everything." Taehyung nodded, steadied more by that quiet promise than any prepared response. The questions started gently, music, projects. Then came the sharper one, wrapped in politeness but heavy with implication, asking about honesty in public spaces. The room leaned in. Taehyung chose a surprising path. He smiled, not defensively but thoughtfully. Honesty doesn't always mean explanation, he said. Sometimes it means respect. Jungkook followed without hesitation. And respect means choosing words that don't turn people into stories. The room fell quiet, not silence but redirected. Afterward, backstage, the adrenaline lingered. Taehyung packed once, then stopped, turning to Jungkook. You realize they'll debate every word, he said. Jungkook nodded. They already were, we just chose not to feed the fire. That choice itself felt controversial in a culture that rewarded escalation. The moment stayed meaningful not because of drama, but because of restraint. A staff member later mentioned that some viewers felt confused, unsure whether to celebrate or worry. Taehyung felt the familiar pull toward responsibility, the urge to clarify for everyone. Jungkook watched him closely and said softly, "You don't owe clarity to strangers at the cost of yourself." The word struck deeper than intended. I just don't want anyone hurt by guessing, Taehyung admitted. Jungkook answered gently but firmly, guessing hurts less than pretending. That was the emotional peak of the day, not loud, just charged. Taehyung took a breath, then made a small but meaningful decision. Then let's agree on this, he said. We protect what's real by being consistent, not by being louder. Jungkook smiled, relief softening his features. That's all I wanted. As evening settled and the building emptied, they stood by the window overlooking the city, lights blinking on one by one, the hum of traffic distant and soothing. Taehyung reflected quietly on how close tension had come to becoming something harsher, how easily misunderstanding could have turned into conflict, and how deliberately they had chosen another route. The excitement no longer came from uncertainty. The night rehearsal room was quieter than usual, lights dimmed to a soft amber glow that traced familiar shapes on the walls, the kind of lighting that made everything feel less like a workplace and more like a memory still being formed. Taehyung sat on the floor stretching his legs, listening to faint music leaking from another studio, while Jungkook adjusted the speaker, scrolling through tracks he didn't seem particularly committed to choosing. The ordinary routine carried an unusual weight. Unresolved emotions have a way of surfacing most clearly when nothing dramatic is happening. "Do you ever worry," Taehyung asked casually, though the question wasn't, "that people only hear what they want to hear?" Jungkook didn't look up. "Every day," he replied, "but I worry more about what happens if we stop listening to ourselves." The simplicity of the answer shifted the air again, subtle but intense, not a fight, not a confession, just a truth placed gently between them. Taehyung leaned back on his hands, eyes drifting toward the ceiling. "I keep thinking about that moment," he admitted, "the way the room reacted like it needed an answer immediately." Jungkook finally turned to face him. "And did you feel like you had one?" Taehyung hesitated. "I felt like I had many," he said honestly, "and none of them belonged to the room." Jungkook nodded slowly. "That's the part people don't see," he said. "How many versions of ourselves we carry just to choose one sentence." The conversation grew warmer, deeper, less about what happened, more about what it meant. Sometimes it felt like no matter what they did, it became a symbol instead of a moment. Taehyung stood and paced once, frustration leaking through his composure. "Sometimes it feels like whatever we say stops being ours the moment it leaves our mouths." Jungkook answered with equal intensity, but without raising his voice. "Then maybe the mistake is thinking moments can't be symbols," he said gently. "Maybe they can be both without being owned by anyone else." The idea lingered, challenging, uncomfortable, real. Taehyung had always believed privacy was the only protection, that unnamed things survived longer, that silence preserved what exposure destroyed. But Jungkook was offering something else. Not exposure, not performance, presence. "When I said I chose someone," Jungkook continued quietly, "I wasn't trying to define the future. I was trying to honor the present." The words landed with unexpected force. Taehyung felt his chest tighten, the emotional weight shifting from fear to clarity. He realized what had unsettled him most wasn't attention. It was sincerity. "You scared me," Taehyung said softly, "because you sounded certain." Jungkook smiled gently. "Certainty doesn't mean pressure," he replied. "It just means I know what I value." Something loosened inside Taehyung at that. The tension eased into warmth as he laughed quietly. "You always choose the hardest way to be honest." Jungkook laughed with him. They talked about boundaries, not as walls but as agreements. Jungkook promised to pause when the weight felt uneven. Taehyung admitted his habit of carrying worries alone. Each admission felt like both a challenge and a gift. Outside, rain began tapping against the windows, rhythmic and calming. Taehyung watched it for a moment before smiling. "See," he said, "sometimes the noise comes after the decision." Jungkook followed his gaze. "And sometimes the storm waits until you're ready for it." The atmosphere shifted again, no longer charged with uncertainty, but alive with mutual understanding. When they packed up to leave, the emotional temperature felt different, not tense, not heavy. Steady. The controversy reframed not as a problem to solve, but as a shared experience to manage together. As they stepped into the cool night air, Taehyung felt something he hadn't expected. Not just relief. Excitement. A quiet anticipation rooted in trust. The kind that doesn't demand answers. The kind that makes the future feel less like pressure and more like possibility. The following day carried a different kind of tension. Not sharp, not dramatic, but heavy in the way the air feels before rain. The kind of atmosphere that doesn't announce itself, but settles quietly into your shoulders. Taehyung felt it the moment he walked into the company building. There was a meeting scheduled. Not formal, not casual either. The kind that lived somewhere between reassurance and responsibility. A conversation that didn't come with scripts but still carried expectations. Jungkook noticed Taehyung's hesitation as they walked side by side down the corridor. "Whatever happens in there," he murmured, "we stay aligned." It wasn't a promise, it was an anchor. Inside the room, the mood was polite, warm. Concern expressed carefully, voices measured, smiles practiced. Questions came gently, asking how they felt about the reactions, whether they were comfortable, whether they needed distance or clarity. Taehyung listened, feeling the familiar instinct rise to protect everyone at once, to smooth edges, to absorb pressure. But Jungkook spoke first. "We're comfortable because we're communicating," he said calmly, "and we don't want comfort to come at the cost of being careless with each other." The room shifted, not defensively, thoughtfully. Taehyung felt a quiet rush of emotion at that. The surprise of being spoken alongside, not spoken for. He added softly, "The tension people feel is often their own reflection, not our conflict." Silence followed, not awkward, reflective, as if something had just been reframed in a way no one had expected. Later, alone again in the hallway, Taehyung let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "You didn't have to do that," he said, voice warm but intense. Jungkook answered immediately, "I wanted to." Not because of strategy. Because of choice. "This isn't about controlling the story," Jungkook continued. "It's about not letting it control us." The line landed with more emotional force than anything said in the meeting. That evening, they sat together in a smaller practice room, lights low, the building nearly empty. The familiar hum of the air system filled the silence like a soft blanket. Taehyung finally voiced the question that had been circling him all day. "Do you think people expect a conclusion?" Jungkook tilted his head, considering. "I think they expect honesty," he said, "and sometimes honesty is admitting that some things are still becoming." Taehyung smiled faintly. "That scares people," he admitted, "unfinished things." Jungkook nodded, "Finished things don't grow." The simplicity of it felt controversial in a quiet way, not because it challenged others, but because it challenged certainty itself. The emotional peak came unexpectedly. "Part of me was afraid," Taehyung confessed, "that if you sounded certain I would have to be too." Jungkook turned fully toward him. "Certainty doesn't demand imitation," he said gently. "It just offers direction." Something inside Taehyung finally loosened. Not a dramatic release, just a quiet peace, the kind that arrives when pressure disappears without needing to be fought. They talked longer than planned, about differences that fit instead of clashed, Jungkook admitting his habit of moving forward when something felt right, Taehyung admitting his instinct to pause and check every angle. And instead of colliding, those instincts balanced each other. When they finally stood to leave, the hallway lights dimmed for the night. The building felt emptier, calmer. "I don't feel pushed anymore," Taehyung said softly. Jungkook smiled. "Good," he replied. "I never wanted you to move faster than your heart." The resolution didn't feel like an ending. It felt like alignment. Not loud, not final, just deeply emotional. The controversy softened by care. the excitement rooted in mutual respect, leaving the sense that whatever the world expected next mattered far less than the fact that they were choosing to move forward together, thoughtfully, honestly, and without fear of letting the story breathe. The tension returned not with noise, but with anticipation, the kind that settles quietly before something meaningful is said, the way the air feels heavier even when nothing has moved yet. Taehyung sensed it as he waited backstage for a small live segment meant to feel relaxed, casual, almost improvised. Jungkook stood beside him, reviewing notes that were clearly unnecessary. What mattered tonight couldn't be scripted. If they asked directly again, Taehyung said, keeping his tone light even though it wasn't, what do we do? Jungkook looked up without hesitation. We answer honestly, he said, without giving more than we're ready to carry. It sounded simple, it was. The studio lights warmed as they stepped into place. The host greeted them with practiced ease, the conversation starting smoothly, drifting through safe topics, music, schedules, plans that didn't touch anything real. Then the inevitable question arrived. Framed politely, carefully worded, but unmistakably pointed. Do you feel like recent moments have changed anything between you? The room leaned in. Taehyung felt the familiar pull between caution and truth. He could sense Jungkook inhaling. About to speak, but then something unexpected happened. Jungkook paused. He glanced at Taehyung. Not a dramatic look, not a performance, just a quiet question in his eyes. Taehyung nodded slightly. A shared decision, made without words. Jungkook spoke first. What changed, he said calmly, is that we talk more openly, and that makes everything steadier. Taehyung followed, voice even but emotionally charged. And when things feel steady, he added, they don't need to be dramatic to be meaningful. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was thoughtful. The controversy dissolved not through denial, but through reframing. The tension eased into something reflective rather than explosive. Backstage afterward, the adrenaline lingered. Taehyung began packing his bag, then stopped, turning to Jungkook with a mix of relief and unresolved emotion. That pause, he said quietly, that was new. Jungkook smiled softly. I wanted you to lead. The admission carried more weight than any declaration. The surprise wasn't in surrender, but in trust. Taehyung sat down again, the conversation intensifying away from microphones. I was afraid answering together would lock us into something, he admitted. Jungkook shook his head gently. It didn't lock us in, he said. It balanced us. That was the emotional peak. Not dramatic, not loud, just precise. Taehyung realized the fear he had carried wasn't about commitment. It was about losing choice. A fear eased now by the way Jungkook consistently left space instead of filling it. They sat side by side, exhaustion settling in, the building growing quieter around them. It's strange how people expect one clear ending, Taehyung said. Jungkook nodded. Stories feel safer when they end, he replied, but real ones don't. Taehyung laughed softly, genuinely this time. I think I'm finally okay with that. Jungkook's response was immediate. Me too. And that mutual acceptance felt like the quiet climax of everything that had been building. The tension resolving not through explanation, but through shared confidence. Later, as they prepared to leave, Taehyung felt a clarity he hadn't expected. Not about labels, not about futures. About presence. About standing in moments, without rushing to define them. Jungkook seemed to sense it too. Whatever comes next, he said softly, we decide it together. Taehyung didn't hesitate. That's enough. And the resolution settled gently. Not with shock. Not with spectacle. But with something steadier. The days that followed felt strangely calm, as if the emotional storm had already passed and left behind a clearer sky. Not empty, not dull, just lighter. Taehyung noticed it in small things. The way he woke up without immediately checking his phone. The way rehearsals felt less like pressure and more like routine again. The way conversations returned to laughter instead of careful silence. Yet beneath that calm, something had shifted. Not in public, not in headlines, but in the quiet space where thoughts lived before being spoken. Taehyung found himself thinking more often about intention, about why certain words felt heavier than others, about how easily people mistook proximity for meaning, and how rarely they noticed the invisible choices made behind every visible moment. One evening, they sat together on the rooftop of the dorm building. The city lights stretched endlessly below, blurred into soft gold lines by the mist in the air. It was cold, but neither of them seemed eager to go inside. Jungkook broke the silence first. "Do you ever feel like we're watched even when no one's there?" Taehyung smiled faintly. "All the time," he replied, "but I think I'm starting to feel less responsible for what people imagine." Jungkook looked at him with quiet curiosity. "That's new." Taehyung nodded slowly. "I used to think if I explained everything clearly enough, no one would misunderstand," he said. "Now I think misunderstandings happen even when you say nothing wrong." Jungkook leaned back, resting his hands behind him. "Then maybe clarity isn't about controlling the story," he said. "Maybe it's about being okay with not owning every version of it." The idea settled between them like a shared realization, heavy but freeing. Taehyung laughed quietly. "You sound like you've been thinking about this longer than I have." Jungkook smiled. "I have," he admitted. "I just didn't know how to say it without making it sound like a conclusion." Taehyung glanced at him. "And now I think conclusions are overrated." That made Taehyung smile wider than he expected. The emotional tone wasn't dramatic anymore. It was reflective, mature, the kind of connection that didn't need tension to feel real. Still, there were moments when old doubts resurfaced. "Do you think people will ever stop waiting for a big reveal?" Taehyung asked. Jungkook thought for a moment. "No," he said honestly, "but I think we can stop performing for it." That answer felt like the real turning point. Not a statement for the world, a decision for themselves. The next week brought another public appearance, another set of cameras, another opportunity for speculation, but this time the energy was different. They joked more, interrupted each other, spoke naturally instead of carefully. And Taehyung realized something important. The less they tried to control perception, the more genuine everything felt. After the event in the car ride back, Taehyung looked out the window, watching the city pass by in streaks of light. "I used to think being honest meant being exposed," he said quietly. Jungkook replied without hesitation. Now I think it just means being aligned." Jungkook smiled, the kind of smile that wasn't meant for cameras. "That's better." The emotional resolution deepened not through answers, but through consistency, through showing up the same way in private as in public, through choosing presence over performance. Taehyung felt a subtle excitement again, not the chaotic kind, but something steadier. The kind that comes from knowing uncertainty no longer feels threatening. The story hadn't ended, but it no longer felt like it needed to. It felt like it had finally found its rhythm. Not as a headline, not as a reveal, but as a shared understanding that some connections don't need to be defined to be real, and some futures don't need to be named to feel possible.